Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion powered by Clean Air Task Force. My name is David Yellen. I'm a strategic advisor here at Clean Air Task Force. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today for this important discussion on powering world-class African analysis for the energy transition. We are proud and grateful to be partnering with the Rockefeller Foundation on this event and many more events this week at this pavilion. One thing I'd like to point out before we get started, on either side of the pavilion you can see these QR codes. That will give you access to live translation, so you can follow along in other languages as well. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Joe Curtin from the Rockefeller Foundation to kick off the event.
Thanks a million, David. I think we can keep this pretty informal because, we all know each other. We're all, and we have a small group here. But I guess I'm going to offer a funder's perspective maybe on, why this initiative started and what our perspective is before handing over to some of the African leaders and experts who are here. So anyway, in our experience, we've, many African countries lack robust ecosystems for energy systems analysis. That can plan at the energy transition. And this is obviously not a matter of expertise. We ourselves work with many leading experts and brilliant minds, but in our experience, oftentimes as experts on the continent develop their expertise, then they get poached by an international organization, and there's this kind of brain drain issue. And so this leads to a number of critical problems that we continuously encounter as the Rockefeller Foundation in our work. And the core problem here is that development partners and African governments often rely on foreign experts, external consultants, to produce one-off investment plans, transition plans, access plans, and these often suffer from a number of deficiencies. They make poor assumptions about the continent and its economic future, and they're biased towards the perceptions of people like me. These plans are often divorced from local context, and they don't understand local policy frameworks. They're static. Oftentimes, you'll receive a PowerPoint presentation, but you won't know what's under that, the numbers under that presentation. So it's a kind of a one-off analysis that needs to be replicated. And these plans are often not understood or owned by the countries and the policymakers that need to implement them. But I think the core problem here is that, as we continue to rely on international consultants, we're actually making the problem worse. We're actually blocking the development of institutions and capacities that can drive the transition based on national expertise and national talent. And so by trying to help, we're actually, I think, making the problem worse. And so in our view, the solution is not improving analysis by non-African institutions or providing short-term trainings or traditional capacity building. We believe that a longer-term approach and a completely new mindset is needed. And it starts with supporting African leaders and experts to tell us in the development community how we should address their needs. And so oftentimes in philanthropy, I think, solving a problem begins with identifying the right leader. And so we came to Rose Matiso about a year ago. Unfortunately, she's not here with us, or she would be making this introductory remark, not me. And we really asked Rose to diagnose this problem. We felt like there was something uncomfortable or challenging about the way we were working, but we couldn't quite figure it out. And so Rose, I think, has done a really amazing job at understanding this complex set of challenges. And she's begun to advise us on how we can begin to build robust human and institutional capacities in a more long-term kind of framework. And so she has consulted widely and brought together a network of experts and leaders, a lot of whom are here in the audience and will participate in today's discussion. And she's come up with a very compelling proposition, which we're calling the Africa Energy Futures Initiative. And Salim from the Africa Climate Foundation is our partner in this initiative. I was going to come back at the end to talk a little bit about what the next steps are for the Rockefeller Foundation in this initiative. But I can say to what we are hoping to do is to fund the Africa Energy Futures Initiative, at least provide seed funding over the next 2 years. And we have secured support from our internal stakeholders that we will be in a position to provide funding. But I would say that no one institution, no one philanthropy can address what we think is, going to require tens of millions of dollars over a coming decade to resolve. And so we can provide seed funding, and really that seed funding, in my view, is about building a kind of an infrastructure that other funders can invest into. And I think Salim will tell us a little bit more about the proposition, and then we're going to hear from a panel of experts. And so with that, I think, Salim, I'm going to pass over to you, and you can call on whomever you wish to discuss this initiative.
I don't want to frighten some people. They can speak from the floor just now. I just want to welcome everybody and really thank you for coming, and especially for the host, the Clean Energy Task Force and the Rockefeller Foundation. We have worked on this particular initiative for over a year. In fact, we had the great pleasure of doing some hard work driven by Rose a couple of weeks back in July at Bellagio in Lake Como, and you were there. So it has come a long way, and we're going to stop talking now, actually get it off the ground, and we believe in the initiative very strongly, but we also recognize that there have been similar kinds of ideas before, and we would definitely want to learn from that, and that's why we have great people like Yoba, who has done a lot of work in this arena. And I'll say a little bit about the panelists just now. And as the African Climate Foundation, just a little bit about us. We are a 3.5-year-old organization, startup, but we work in many countries at the moment. Primary focus has been on energy transitions, particularly in South Africa, Senegal, Nigeria. We're doing some work with EBRD in Egypt, Kenya, and also Namibia, and some work also in DRC. And our experience in working in this arena shows us the importance of actually developing strong African capability. There are three main reasons for that. That philanthropies don't like their funds depleted by big consulting firms. I'll be very honest about it, because they're very expensive. And philanthropies are not meant to subsidize expensive fees, if I may say so. I'll say it in these four walls here. Number two is there is a lot of talent on the continent. There are some really good institutions. And if you want to make them work better, we have to find ways to strengthen the coordinating mechanisms and then build a new cadre of people. Hopefully they won't go to the consulting firms, and they'll be able to work with the governments. And thirdly, I think there's a growing interest from governments for the right technical support. It has to be trusted. It has to be locally embedded. And deal with the needs to support a lot of energy transition work on the continent. It's not only about decarbonization, it's also about energy access. And it's over 600 million people that don't have energy access, and affordable energy access. The important thing is that we have to make this journey. We've got to give it a try. We're not going in there with grandiose ideas. We are going to build slowly, gradually, and then be able to pick it up. So the contributions from Rockefeller, we will provide some seed funding. And hopefully in the new first quarter of this next year, we will start recruiting a lead person to start building up the hub. So I'd like to, with those words, just invite the panelists and engage them and the audience on a couple of issues. So let me invite Lily O'Donnell. And while she's walking up, I'll say a little about her. She's for Energy and Climate Innovation Africa for Clean Air Task Force. And I know Lily since the day we started ACF. And she did some really great work. We were doing ecosystem analysis in Kenya. And you were working with Murefu, if I'm not mistaken, EED. So I'd like to invite him as well, managing partner. I don't know what EED stands for, but maybe you'll say something about that. So I'm sorry for that. And Murefu did some really excellent work with Rose on building a picture, analysis of capability, needs, and some of the deft arguments that you always talk about when you debate this. And I know Yoba Sakona, when I first set up ACF, he was the first person I consulted about, and yourself, Jacob. If you remember, we were on a call together. I think you were in England and Yoba was in Germany. So, and that was 3 years, I still remember very clearly that discussion we had. And he's the vice chair. Are you still the vice chair? No? But we'll call you the vice chair because presidents are still called presidents, so we'll call you vice chair of the IPCC. And then after this, we'll have some closing remarks from Joseph. No? No, he will. So I'm going to kick off, and I'm actually going to kick off with Yoba because he's the elder here. And Yoba, you've seen this before. I know you're going to say that. And I just wanted your experience on, you set up a whole big, I think it was called ARI, if I'm not mistaken, Africa Renewables Energy Initiative. And just for us to get a sense of how that was conceived, how did modeling work and energy planning work play into that? Where was the capabilities that you would have drawn on? And what are the lessons we can learn from that? And I want to give the floor to you. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to take part to this conversation, but we only have 1 hour. I cannot tell my life of 40 years on issues in 1 hour. I think, let me start by back to 82, 81. We had a similar problem as the climate, that was energy, and facing two major issues. And that was after the second oil shock. All the countries, north and south, wanted to have some kind of energy independence. And then they look at what kind of policies is needed. And then this is how the renewable pop up. At that time, I was against renewables. At that time, because
oil and gas.
Yes, because that was on the issue of energy access. I say because renewable was unbelievable high price. And in that context, the European indicated that they need to define their energy policy. And then for them, defining their energy policy, they have to have independent thinker for the South to define their own energy policy in the South. They said that it is not a policy that's defined by the European, but the South define their own energy policy, and it has to be independent thinkers from think tanks, universities, and others. And then they went around the world, and then they identified a number of institutions, including Bariloche Foundation, COPE de Rio de Janeiro, Terry pop up at that time, and this is how I joined ENDA and then to set up. We created a network called Cooperative Program on Energy and Development. For us, energy is a fundamental development issue because there is no need for energy, there is development need, and energy is a means to achieve your objective. And we were in a dilemma because you look at African countries, and then you look at China, you look at Brazil, you look at India, you look at the other continent. For sure, we do not have the same problem, the same issues. And modeling was fundamental. And at that time, a model had been developed, a technical economic model. And then we had two types of model at that time, technical economic model like LEAP, and then econometric models. And when we start discussing, I said, no, I'm not taking that route. I said, fundamentally, the fundamentals are not in place. The African context, what is important, critical fundamental, is the issue of firewood for cooking. And then we need to concentrate on that. And then we need to provide evidence. We need to collect information, data. If the energy statistics are today at IEA, is the work we have done. And then we start working with that network. They look at different issues, and then we said that, no, we will do good fundamentals. And then to start collecting information. And then from that, and then we also did some research. I said that how we will use our research. If we want to use it, maybe 1-2 countries, they will, but how to use that to make the continent profiting to that. And then we organized, I traveled across African countries. I went to all countries in West Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, in Angola, in Mozambique, all of them to find out which university can start working on energy planning, because that was a fundamental problem, how to get the African expert to be trained on energy planning. I did not find. At that time, South Africa was in the apartheid, we could not. Later on, I joined Anton Ebrard, and then we do that. So I did not find universities that are interested. We set up the first energy training planning course in Dakar in 1985. Some of the to bring the fundamentals through that training program, because we said that we need to change the mindset of those who are making decisions in the administration, central government administrations. Because at that time, energy was assimilated only to utility. And then we changed the mindset and then focus on collecting information. This is how the first energy balances, we developed that. And then for that, we have to say that we need to set the issue, the problem. Before you set the problem, you cannot take the model, because the problem is that modeling is good, it's fine. But you end up to work for modeling rather than setting your problem. Modeling is only an instrument, a tool to analyze. It is not an end by itself. And then, okay, let me stop from here, because I will go to too much detail.
No, I want to ask you more on
yeah,
that.
yeah.
So when you went around to try to find skills for energy planning, you found it at universities. You said South Africa you couldn't use, and that was Anton Eberhard's outfit, if I remember. No. And I just was curious as to, at 1985, when you did the energy training program, were you able to create demand and expand the program?
There is no single African country we have not trained on energy planning. It changed completely the approach of energy in energy administrations. And then from Egypt to South Africa. And every year we had a training program, and then we bring together. And then when we design also, in designing the program, we said that I bring in Dakar, SPRU, EAGA, all the different expertise on energy issues in Africa, Latin American, Asian. And then we discussed the program, training program. I said, no, our program has to be unique, tailored in the African issues, not something we just take outside. And then we combine two different aspects. 3-month training course. The first part of the training course, we don't talk about energy. We only talk about development. And then the second part will bring energy element in development. And then the third part, we use the tools. And the fundamental tool is the statistics. Without the evidence, without statistics, you cannot go anywhere. And on the training course, and then what we did, we brought the participant in 3 different environments in Senegal. I was based in Senegal, we did in Senegal. And then we asked them in 3 weeks to come up with an energy plan for the area where they were exploring in 3 months. They collect information, they collect everything, and then they came back with a plan how to develop. You know, I broke my leg, my arm in here. And that was on one of the work.
Modeling work or?
No, that was on the field work, because the problem is that we have to combine the theoretical, the practical, and then to get people in the field. And then the kind of training we made, you only found it in our place. If you go to Oxford, you go to MIT, you go to Zurich Polytechnic, or you go to Mine de Paris, you will never find it. And then we make it unique, tailored on the issue and the perspective of the Africans.
Was Morefe part of the training program?
I was a toddler.
You were told. Okay, at least we know your age now. So I'm going to come to you, Morefe. You worked on this early phase assessment, and I was curious as to what you discovered in terms of capabilities. You know, how would you sort of characterize that, and what about issues around data and evidence, and is there such a thing as a single modeling tool, or are there other ways of thinking about this? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks to CATF Rockefeller for organizing this and also for having me. You'd asked what EED stands for. So it used to stand for Energy, Environment and Development Advisory, but that's quite a mouthful. So we just call it EED. So no loss there. Good. And we have been fortunate to carry out projects in more than 30 African countries in energy, water, and climate change. And on the question of data, so the first big problem is that in some jurisdictions, the data doesn't exist. So we've done, for example, work in South Sudan. We did the first national energy access survey, a national energy access survey. It was the first of its kind. So there was absolutely no data on energy access. We've also worked in Sudan. At the moment, we're doing some work in Somalia. So in many of these jurisdictions, there is barely any data that you can use to guide a planning process. And of course, without data, then you cannot do any planning. And still with data, there's also the question of disaggregated data. So you may have some data, but it's not disaggregated, say, between the national level and the subnational level. You may have data that's not disaggregated based on gender, for example. And, people talk about gender, it's almost like it's a popular thing, but it's really important to look at these things from a gender perspective. There's some work we did in Zambia, and we found that none of the households that own an LPG tank for cooking is actually female-led. And so that statistic, we were designing this program for the World Bank, that statistic for us at least helped us inform the World Bank to say, if you're coming up with a subsidy program to support the uptake of LPG, a good indicator is whether it's female-led or male-headed household. So the question of disaggregation is a big one. Then the second issue is that in sub-Saharan Africa, a big portion of the energy operates in the shadows. It's in the informal economy. So this is firewood for cooking. This is charcoal. So if you're talking about electricity, you have all the numbers. You can get all the numbers from the utility. If you're talking about oil and gas, it's imported, they track all the numbers. But if you're talking about firewood, which in some countries contribute up to 65% of the total energy supply, there's very little data on that. So a big portion of the data that we need to come up with energy plans, and I don't mean electricity plans, and I know that's not what we're talking about. To come up with energy plans, there's a big gap there. And then the third issue I would say is there's a conflation between energy and electricity. So everywhere we go, in very many forums, the Africa Energy Forum, everybody's talking about electricity. It's electricity this and electricity that. How do we move our power grids to net zero? So a lot of the conversations around energy are really on electricity, which contributes a marginal portion of the total energy supply. So again, there's an overemphasis on electricity, and therefore we don't pay too much attention to the informal sources. So I would say, I would characterize that as some of the key challenges we've seen in our work on the continent.
Thank you. Can I just ask a follow-up question? So, IRENA and IEA have a lot of data, and I just wanted your opinion about the relevance of that data, because when we were doing some analysis of that, when they did cost of wind and solar turbines, they referenced the data from other sources. I just wanted your opinion on that. And if there was a modeling hub that was being set up in Africa, why would it be different? What are the kind of nuances that would have to go into the assumptions of the modeling? Yeah.
So that's a good question, and also it sort of emphasizes the problem, right? So if you look at the IRENA data, there's very little data on cooking, for example. Very little data. There's barely any data on cooking, and cooking is the largest consumer of energy in most of sub-Saharan African countries. So if you go to IRENA, you'll get good data or some reasonably good data on electricity planning, right? Because you mentioned like the cost of wind and renewables, but there's barely anything on cooking. So all the planning then ends up focused on electricity, be it on-grid or be it decentralized. So this is really the heart of the issue.
Thanks. Lily, you've worked at Clean Energy Task Force. Clean Air. Sorry, Clean Air Task Force. Sorry, CATF. I should know that one. I've interacted with you so many times. So old age and memory is getting lost. You did some work in East Africa, and so I just wanted to pick up on your perspectives on issues around capabilities, planning capabilities, data, and what your feeling is on the kind of initiative that we want to take forward. And then number two is maybe if you can talk about US perspectives on Africa's energy transitions and needs, since you're based there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Salim. And so I think I'm going to talk about work that actually precedes my time here at CATF. We did, I believe it was in 2015 or 2016, we set out to do the first deep dive analysis of mini grids in Tanzania, just trying to map out, where mini grids are found, just characterizing, where mini grids were, and it's actually opened to me a world of a deep understanding of the world of data and its limits on the African continent when it comes to analysis that informs our understanding about not just the energy transition, but energy development in general. And I think fundamentally, I wouldn't say that countries do not have data. I think that the data is available most of the time. It's not accessible most of the time. And that becomes a challenge. Sometimes it's available, but it's not in I remember we were in Uganda, and they have really good data, but it's in huge spreadsheets, and it's just difficult to manipulate the data. And so you realize that there are big capacity challenges there both with collecting the data, but with managing the data in a way which makes it usable and which makes it relevant. And I think this has relevance as we talk about modeling as well and thinking about the energy transition. I think Mrefu has touched on one point, which is in the cooking sector where we don't have much data. I think one of the reasons why we actually face that challenge goes to the climate framing in general. Of course, the climate framing it arose in the West, and it arose in a context where the energy system had been identified as the cause of the climate problem, and I think the power sector in particular. So the focus has been on emissions, on shifting trends in the power sector, and I think that same thinking has basically been transferred into our context as well when it comes to what is needed within climate. Because if you actually look carefully at African emissions, yes, African emissions are low, but electricity or even energy sector emissions are really, it's less than 40% for the African continent. Much of the emissions are coming from land use change, forestry, and agriculture. And so it's going to unsustainable agricultural practices, going to the use of firewood for cooking. So if we were even really serious about driving down emissions, even though they are still low on the African continent, we'll be looking at these sectors very critically. Cooking would be a big thing. Agriculture would be a big thing. But I think the framing of the issue and the source, coming to your second question about how the U.S. views Africa and the energy transition, is that I think that the framing is really a transferred framing, and we are struggling with it. Even the term energy transition and how that battles with the context of energy, with the concept of energy access, is a challenge. So, and we struggle to actually even say that energy access matters, because it's almost like it's rivaling thinking in the climate space. So I think that is on the local level, when we talk about data needs and all of that, the data is available. I think there are huge gaps, institutional gaps, capacity gaps, and sometimes just the resources to be able to develop the data to a point where it's easily usable. But we also need to question the source of the framing of the climate problem, of the energy transition problem, and how that affects the solutions that we feel are relevant and that we should be prioritized as we look at the energy transition.
Can I ask a question, and then I think Yoba will come into this. The Europeans have a particular, I would say, two-faced approach. One is that they're telling us not to use gas. On the other hand, they are using gas, lots of it, and importing it from the US. US is the biggest exporter of gas at the moment. Is that the same sentiment? Let me not call it two-faced. It might horrify a lot of people. Hypocritical is the word I'm looking for. Yeah, just. If you want both, any of the panelists can respond to it. And I want to relate this because there's a big discussion about LPG as a source for cooking. Because a lot of households can't just get electrification that soon. So,
no, let me go to the point both of them have mentioned on the issue, because the starting point, you have to set your agenda. And clearly, the energy transition agenda, clearly, actual agenda is not an African agenda. There is one fundamental transition that is needed in Africa. The other part is jump-starting, because you need to build a system. You are not moving from one system to another system. Where the transition should happen is on firewood and charcoal. This is as important. I have not seen anyone saying that we need to phase out the use of charcoal and firewood by 2040. I challenge my colleague, they walk away on the modeling, because I asked Jacob and others, I said, okay, so we start drafting energy transition for Africa, and then that we put in place, we said that, okay, fundamentally, by 2040, we need to phase out completely. We said that 2030, to phase out the use of charcoal and firewood for cooking. And it's possible. Economically, it's possible. And then if we want to phase out the use of fossil fuel by 2030, by 2050, we can run a lot of models. There's no single model you can run. And if you want to phase out the use of charcoal and firewood, this is fundamental. It's a huge implication. It's a life of billions of people. And this is a real issue no one is addressing. And then I challenge also the integral assessment modeler. I was with their forum 2 weeks ago. I said that those are fundamental elements, fundamental issues we are dealing with in the African context. And then we completely left it out. Actually, they talk about it at the political level, they put billions, but there is no evidence. There is no support of evidence and analysis that brings some of the elements that will allow us to say that we'll do the modeling by 2040 or by 2050, it will be completely phased out. The technology exists, it's doable, it has huge implication on climate, it has huge implication on biodiversity, it has huge implication on livelihood and so on and so forth, and all the SDGs as related to that. Just an entry point for a larger problem is completely marginalized.
Thank you. Lily, did you want to respond to Morefa? Yeah, you want to?
No, I was going to talk about.
Yes, let me just weigh in on the LPG question. If you look at the data, because we're talking about energy planning and data, if you look at the data and you care for climate, you have to support LPG for cooking. If you look at the data. In a country like Kenya, access to clean cooking was 15% in around 2010. And right now it's about 30%. And most of those households that have transitioned to cleaner cooking is through LPG. So LPG has, of course, still emits greenhouse gas emissions. But if you compare LPG with firewood or with charcoal, it's like night and day. And then also to Lily's point, if your emphasis is only climate, then you also miss out on the other benefits of a transition. So for example, like health benefits. So with LPG, although now there are also studies on the health impacts of LPG, but it's indisputable that a household using LPG is better off than a household using firewood and charcoal. It's indisputable. And then the last point is, in many contexts, LPG is a byproduct of the petroleum process. So again, if you don't do that, you will end up perhaps flaring it, which again is harmful to the climate. So for me, if you just look at the data and you care about climate and you're thinking about Africa, you cannot miss LPG on your menu. Yeah.
You shouldn't say that so loudly in this corridors. They will get very upset with you.
You cannot miss LPG.
Lily?
No, I just wanted to respond to you had made you asked about the Africa, Europe, Africa, US, and I think yes, I think the general sentiment is that there's a very hypocritical relationship when it comes to views and policies around, and I think natural gas in particular. I think when we were going in the lead up to Glasgow, we had announcements both from the US and actually through the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and then from European countries that there would be no more funding of natural gas exploration of fossil fuels in general. And then there was the Ukraine war and there was a crisis, and then immediately we were redefining, we became very confused as to whether natural gas was a fossil fuel or not, or was clean or not. So I think embedded in that is a hypocritical perspective. But I also think that there's also a lesson embedded in that energy security matters, and that countries are going to tend to their energy security concerns and secure that when push comes to shove. And Africans should do the same thing. If we have to transition, or if we have to think about transitioning our cooking systems, we should do it, and we should see that as relevant. And we should be able to advance that. That's what's important for us, because other countries advance what's important for them when it comes to that. You take something like the Inflation Reduction Act, it's great in the US, but where is the opportunity for African countries to be able to access the US market with green products? So here we are with a challenge that is global, but the opportunity for us to basically tap into what could benefit the African community, it's basically non-existent. So I think there are really two sides of the coin in each of these, and it's important that as Africans, we advance what matters to us. It's energy access, it's transforming our cooking systems, it's transforming how we do agriculture, and that's what matters to us. It doesn't have to be couched in emissions to become relevant for a climate conversation.
Yuba, you want to say something last? I want to invite the audience to. Okay. Can I invite anybody from the audience if you want to say something? Do you want to talk about the Microsoft initiative? Yeah. Yeah. The energy.
Okay, so Joe is kind enough to give a little bit of a high-level synopsis as to what we're working on with Rose. And this is the Energy Futures Initiative, Africa Energy Futures Initiative, where we'll be setting up Africa's first energy modeling and climate modeling innovation hubs throughout the continent. We'll be working with local universities and institutions that already have the capability but just need the additional funding to be able to maybe have access to more technologies or to be able to retain the professionals on the continent instead of them heading off abroad where there may be better opportunities for them. And this way, the story that is being told for Africa's energy transition is being told by locals and not being told by very expensive consulting agencies that from abroad, where, as Joe said, are producing one-off reports that don't actually provide longevity and repetition, right? Because then these governments are going to have to perpetually pay for these reports over and over again. And what we want to do is to be able to produce this kind of data and this level of reporting specifically on the continent so that it's just readily available, it's accessible, and it's being told by the people who know the story the best, which is the locals. And this also minimizes the overgeneralization that happens in international policy in respect to Africa. And this way, the story is being told by each and every individual country as opposed to a generalization of the entire continent.
Thank you very much. My name is Sheila Paracha, and I'm from the Energy International Network on Gender Sustainable Energy. And Yuba Sokona is one of the founding members of Energia, and I happen to be one of his students and role models. And one of the things that Yuba taught us was the integrated energy planning. Where you might have remembered with the MDGs, and we didn't have an energy MDG, and Professor Sokona was one of the first to start linking energy to all the other SDGs and really take a concrete example like the multifunctional platforms in West Africa to show how on the ground that made a difference. So that's linked to the question that I have. I think I've mentioned integrated energy planning, and you've talked about cooking energy, and I think one of the challenges we have with cooking energy is where does it sit? Who takes responsibility for it, and that you really need to have an integrated response to it from sourcing all the way up to use. So I was wondering if you could speak to that issue, because I've been working with energy policy and energy planning, mainly coming from a gender perspective, but even to get the Ministry of Gender and Ministry of Energy for us to work together and to plan together has been a challenge. So you can imagine, if you're talking about agriculture, I fully agree with the comments made about what needs to drive our energy development is really the end use and the demand cycle. But if you're talking about agriculture, if you talk about health, it becomes extremely difficult. And here we're not even talking about the National Bureau of Statistics and their capacity and their engagement. So I was wondering if you could speak to that. I did want to say that Rwanda has emphasized that they are phasing out charcoal, but there has been a lot of contention and pushback with saying that we want to go to LPG. And I think one of the challenges I find is that we tend to silo too much. And I think one of the other things that Professor Sokona taught us is that we need to look at it from a service point of view. So regardless what the source is, the end goal should be livelihoods and what the services that are being provided. So I think, the option could be, as a transition, is LPG. electricity needs to be put in place. And just on the cooking energy, the gains that we've made on SDG 7.2, target 7.2, have really been delivered by China and by India, and that has been by transitioning to LPG for clean cooking. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Great discussion. I mean, one question I have is perhaps, it relates to what you were saying, Yuba, in terms of, when you guys were doing the training for integrated planning work. It seems to me that this needed to be context specific and context relevant. In other words, not even just national, but you're talking about sub-national level, especially if you're talking about pulling together the data, then this kind of bottom-up approach would need to happen. And so the question then is, it's good to be able to do that, but how do you sustain the level of, let's say, a national program that is, a bottom-up? What sort of institutions, what kind of knowledge systems, what type of, how do we sort of usher the skills that is going to be required for this? And who should pay for this? I mean, right now we're talking about international actors, providing, benevolent sort of resources, but isn't there some kind of responsibility that needs to be taken elsewhere within the country itself? What's the problem? Why can't they do it? If they cannot do it, then how, all this international money is going to dry out at some point. Then what?
Can I think that this question, the easy response to that is that this has not happened by accident. It has not happened by accident because there is two concepts in the African context. Unless you solve those problems, that is very difficult, we can move. And then I will have a question to the philanthropists related to that. Those are two elements that created
Not
by...
difficult questions to us.
No, not a difficult question. It's an evidence. The point is that the social adjustment program started in the 80s. And then they brought two concepts in the continent: consultants and project. Because you go to all countries, knowledge institution has been completely dismantled. They are not creating knowledge. And then it's you just take a consultant, he came, he go to internet, he just cut and paste and then produce a report given. Everybody's
This time we've got ChatGPT, he's got no problem.
no, this is the reality, because the knowledge-based the knowledge-based institution, instead of investing in knowledge-based institutions, that's the case in the other part of the world. Yes, they have knowledge-based, you cannot mention any single. We used to have a number of institutions in Africa back to the 80s. And then when we established EDRC and all other, and then none of those organizations exist today because the consultants have substituted. This was one element. The social adjustment program said that there is no need to produce knowledge, international experts.
You need to write a paper about it.
Yes.
No, seriously.
I wrote a paper on it that was published in the, it was published, Climate Policy. And then the second element is the project. Project means you have no idea what you want to do. You start a project, and then to test an idea, and then the idea will inform the policy. And then in the African country, everything is related to project. You move from one project to another project. You move from one project to another project. There's no policy. And then those are two concepts. And as a matter of fact, I have two friends that publish editorial for Nature. Ambush and Sonja, they produce an editorial, Nature of the 30th. You can read it. And then I was curious to see that they said that the philanthropists put 2 billion, almost 2 billion on capacity issue on the philanthropists. on the capacity issue, out of the 2 billion is only 68 million that goes for African issue, and then largely for those who are not in Africa. That the problem is not 3% does not go to the African. And then how you can have an evidence-based work, because the problem is that you cannot bring all those changes if you do not have the evidence base. Without the evidence base, you will not be able to go anywhere. And then the problem is that they launch millions for clean cooking or electric cooking. There's no evidence base. And I tried to find out, I decided to go back to Africa and then to move Europe and then to start working at the local level. This is what I'm trying. And then try to find out where I can find analytical work, evidence-based on those fundamental issues, critical issues. There is no places in Africa you can find. You will find all the information in the north. The people who do not need to define those different policies have the information. And they have resources to have more information. While in the African context, you have no resources to have any information. Sorry, I have been this is too passionate. I did not.
I just wanted to. I just wanted to react to what Jakob mentioned, and I don't even know if I have the answer. But as I think back, I'm also wondering, what the impact of the legacy, and I'm not talking philanthropy here, but the legacy of how the multilateral, bilateral system has worked in Africa and what that has meant for our knowledge systems. The truth is that if USAID comes into a country to work, they are not interested in working with the local experts. They have their consultants. They pay their consultants, and the money goes back to the U.S. In fact, it's a growth opportunity for those countries. It's the same with Europe and all these other countries. I remember I was once in Tanzania, and I think Enreka from the United States had developed an energy plan for them. The people at the ministry didn't even know the assumptions behind the analysis, but they are supposed to implement it. How on earth is that supposed to happen? So I think that there's also something to be said about the legacy of how the multilateral, bilateral system has worked. I think it has in many ways downplayed the value of indigenous knowledge to a very, very large extent. It's downplayed the value of indigenous knowledge. It has crippled us developing our systems. And I think our governments have also dropped the ball, quite frankly, and maybe it's because we don't see the demand for the skill sets that we have. But maybe the governments have also dropped the ball in terms of investing locally in building the data and in just supporting with the analysis on the ground. So that's something that I wanted to flag, that it's a structural issue that we shouldn't let out of our sight.
Thank you. Morefa, last comment? Yeah.
Yes, to Jacob's question, very briefly. So there's a bright spot. There's a least cost power development planning process in Kenya. It started in the mid-1990s with money from the World Bank and also a few other donor agencies. And they brought in consultants to work with colleagues from Kenya Power, from the regulator, from KenGen. And by the year 2010, the colleagues in the parastatals actually do it themselves. They do the least cost power development planning process every 2 years without any external funding, without any external consultants. In fact, just this year, before we came here, they had a retreat in a small town outside of Nairobi. It's called Naivasha. So they would go there, guys from Kenya Power, guys from KenGen, EPRA, and a few others, and they do the modeling themselves. And they use all these modeling tools. So there are some examples where external parties can provide seed funding, and then it leads to almost like a bottom-up process. So now the question is, what does the government want to do? And they give it to this team of government experts, no consultants, local or international, that do it. So there is a way you can do it. And one lesson for this initiative, I think, because we did a paper on LCPDP and why we thought it's successful, is to identify leaders in the sector and people who really care about these issues and work with them. And then to Sheila's question very briefly, we've seen the same challenge in the countries we've worked in. So we're doing the Sierra Leone energy cooking strategy. We did some work in Zambia, and also we're doing the strategy in Kenya. So with cooking, if you think about upstream issues, you have the Ministry of Agriculture, because if you think about bioethanol, if you think about biogas, there's Ministry of Agriculture. If you come downstream, there's a Ministry of Health because of household air pollution. And then there's a Ministry of Energy, which is in charge of the ministry itself. But you also have Treasury, because there are issues with taxation, importation of cooking fuels, and solution. So what's been happening is that there's now a coalition of ministries, like an interministerial coordination committee, that is required to actually lead the process on cooking. And in some countries, there is now initiatives set up a delivery unit in the office of the president. So again, there are things that are going on that are sort of moving the conversation forward and where it should be going. Thank you.
So I have to conclude, unfortunately, because we're running. They're going to kick us out of here, and I need Joe to conclude with final remarks. But just to say, you would agree with me, Joe. This was a very lively, interesting discussion, and from the Nairobi discussion. Not to say that was a bad one, but and Yoba, thank you very much for coming and sharing your insights, because you've been doing this work for decades. Not that you're that old either, but just to say, I really am grateful for you coming, and we will continue taking this process forward. So I would like to invite Joe. Thanks. Jakob, you want to say something? Yeah, yeah. Are you okay, or did you want to make quick comments?
Okay. So thanks again for a really interesting conversation. I feel like when I'm listening to this conversation, I really think, who sets the agenda? You know, and these are sensitive issues, right? Because there's a power dynamic here. You know, we're a funder, we're sitting in New York. We have a lot of power to set the agenda. And for us, it's about trying to let go of that power. And quite honestly, sitting in New York, you're surrounded by consultants. You're surrounded by universities. Every single, you know, from MIT to Imperial College, everybody tells you, oh, we've got this, we're doing this. You know, we've got the model, we've got the solution. You know, Google X has convinced the Rockefeller Foundation now that they've got this tapestry model, and this is just a technical silver bullet, and if only we can give us $20 million and we can implement this model in Nigeria, and it's going to change the world, and it's all just bullshit. You know, it's all just bullshit. And then the other... yeah. So, and the other thing that is important is the incentives that are facing us. You know, we come to the COP and we want to have a glitzy solution. We want to have a PowerPoint. We want to have a coalition of people who are going to come together and do something amazing, but nothing ever happens. And so in a way, it's kind of disheartening. And so I think it's very important for me to be sitting here in the position of a listener and a learner. And quite honestly, I learned, even though I know intellectually some of these issues, I learned a lot from the discussion, just being in the position of listener. And you know, the importance of clean cooking. Of course, I know this, but hearing it again in your words really just kind of inverted the idea for me, and very important. And I think listening to the important, you know, this idea of project-based funding rather than funding that can actually, you know, put institutions on a more sustainable footing and create this kind of knowledge ecosystem, create these kind of centers of excellence, I think is just so important for us. So, you know, we are going to try and, you know, eke out some funding for this, but the funding that the Rockefeller Foundation can put into creating these ecosystems, to creating these centers of excellence, is only going to be a drop in the bucket. So we need our philanthropy partners to come together. We need to elevate this agenda, and we need to really sort of try and invert this kind of power dynamic. And so what we want to do as a funder is we want to, you know, support the Africa Climate Foundation to really kind of set the agenda here and to create a sort of basically a network that can be funded by philanthropy. And then we want to have a bidding system, right, where centers of excellence from around the continent can apply for funding to put, and just one last thing I want to say is, like, I worked in energy systems modeling, right? It takes years, right? It takes years to get the model, to make it to be relevant, and then you need to create those linkages to policy making. It's absolutely useless having a model. If you don't have a model that's refined, that actually is generating policy relevant insights, and if that model isn't influencing policy and influencing planning, it's useless. And that's an ecosystem, and it takes years. It takes years to make to actually generate that ecosystem. And so just coming in like with one-off funding, with project-based funding, it's absolutely useless. So to do this work properly, I think is going to take a decade, and we need to mobilize the ecosystem behind us. We need to mobilize the funders behind us. And so that's our intention. We don't know if it's possible, but we're at the very start of that journey. And so thank you again to our panelists, thank you to Salim, and thank you to our audience.